First thing I ought to tell you students is I went to Texas Tech University 60 some odd years ago. My half-year cost was $50. I could take as many courses as I wanted. Since I lived in New Mexico, it cost me $50. Those living in Texas just had to pay $25. Another thing I'd like to point out is we were kind of sheltered over in the Philippines and Japan, and we didn't have any reporters or photographers embedded with us. We were embedded with the Japanese, and there wasn't much publicity other than verbal. There's no pictures of what happened except for what Japanese took. Now, you're supposed to have read Tenney's book, and what happened to him happened to all of us in the first 2 years of the war in various degrees. It might have been worse beating or might have been easier beating. The physical damage to us might have been worse or less than what happened to Tenney. We all went through the same thing, so I'm not going to tell you anything about the first 2 years. I want to tell you about the hell ships, which really hasn't had any publicity until the last few years. I thought there was 5 or 6 hell ships, and from what I had read, I thought I was probably on the best hell ship. They were all called hell ships by the individual prisoners on those boats, and they were also called Benjo Maru. Benjo is Japanese for toilet, and Maru is Japanese for ship. And each one of these ships were called that by their occupants. In my case, I had loaded on this little tub of a ship. Fortunately, it was a little ship. October 1st, 1944, and by that time, the Americans had control of the seas around the Philippines as well as the air. We loaded on the first of the month about 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was 2.5 days later before we weighed anchor. By that time, we were in a bad situation. Like my neighbor said here, we were crowded in. There was just 500 of us in the hole I was in. And by the time we weighed anchor, and it was in the hot season of the year, we were all suffering from lack of water. We were suffering from lack of food, but that didn't matter much because we had been used to that. But the lack of fresh air down in a hole 15 or 20 feet below deck, covered with huge timbers. After 10 days and nights, we arrived in another port. We found a couple days later we were in Hong Kong, maybe 500 miles from Manila, across the South China Seas. During that 10 days, we had 10 men die in the hold I was in, mostly from lack of sanitation and fresh air. About the third night out, somebody hollered, "We're being pinged by a submarine, we're going to be torpedoed," and all hell broke loose in the hold. People trying to climb out of the hold on the one little ladder on the one corner of the hold and being kicked down by the Japs above. And after a couple of minutes, somebody started saying the Lord's Prayer, and everybody joined in, and that quieted things down. And about that time, there was a tremendous explosion, and we found that we were in a convoy. All we could see was flames and red sky through the cracks in the timbers above us. That happened a couple nights later. But we finally got to Hong Kong, and every night we would try to get out of the harbor, and the next morning we'd be back in. Apparently they couldn't get through the American ships at sea. While we were in the 10 days we were in Hong Kong, we were strafed and bombed by American ships, American planes out of China. But we were allowed up one time on deck to be washed down by a hose from the dirty water of the harbor, and that was a tremendous relief. On the 11th night there, we finally got out of Hong Kong, and after a few days we ended up in Takao, Formosa, which is now Taiwan. There, after several days of physical checks by the Japanese, we were finally loaded on a truck and taken to a little schoolyard. During the 39 days it took us to get there, 39 men had died in my hold. A few weeks later, we were loaded back up and taken back to the harbor, and we were loading on a real good Japanese ship. It was a troop transport, and it was a very good ship, and we sailed to Japan. But the day we were loading up, the Americans came in and bombed again and got a ship. I found out later from dates and times and reading that this was one of the ships that had probably the worst time of all. We had one ship that left shortly after we left with 1,800 men. It was torpedoed. 7 men were not rescued. They were able to get enough lumber to make a raft and finally reached the East China coast where the Japanese were not, and the Chinese there took them through the lines to American troops, and they finally got home about a year before we did. 5 men were also picked up by my ship that had been on that ship that was torpedoed. Another ship leaving Mindanao for Manila with 700 men in it was torpedoed, and 81 men survived from that. A third ship left shortly after we did was bombed at Subic Bay, which was had been American naval unit there. About 100 men were killed on that bombing. The ones that survived were able to get to shore, and they were placed on a tennis court for about 3 weeks under the sun, nothing to protect them. Finally loaded on a second ship, taken to Taiwan, and that was a ship that was sunk the day we were loading on another ship to go to Japan. They were finally loaded on a third ship, and 700 of them were still surviving out of the 1,800, roughly 1,700 men that started out. When they reached Japan several weeks later, 450 of them were still alive out of the 1,700. And a third ship with 1,800 men disappeared. We never did hear anything from them. I've since learned that through the last few books that I've read They claim there was 13 or 14 hell ships, and they are building a memorial for the hell ships at the present time. And one of the books that I've read was written by a son of one of the men that had been on the ship that was sunk twice by the American friendly fire. And his statistics, and I don't know where he got them, but he knows more about what happened to those people than I do, and I was there. He claims that there was 10,700 and some odd men, prisoners, killed by friendly fire, submarines and torpedoes and bombing in the last 3 months of 44 than were killed in all the rest of the years. In my regiment, the ship that was sunk twice in Subic Bay, Lungapu and Takao, was mainly officers. They had separated the officers from the men at the first of the imprisonment, and most of the officers were in that ship. And in my regiment, 49% of the men never returned, and 53% of the officers never returned, but that was mainly because of the friendly fire. Thank you.
I'll give you a brief history in that I was born in Escondido. I went to school in Escondido. I lived in Valley Center, and I joined the Navy out of high school and ended up in the Asiatic Fleet and in the Manila area. And as a result of that, the ship was damaged in a collision that was on. It was damaged in a collision, and we ended up in the Navy Yard at Cavite when the war started, and on the third day of the war, we got hit with a bomb, and I got put in the hospital. So I ended up in Manila in Sternberg Army Hospital, and the Navy group got over there and took us out of there. And one thing leads to another. They finally discharged me when I healed up and to the Japanese. And I was in Pasay Elementary School, which was later Nichols Field Detail, I believe, and in Bilibid for a while. Went to Clark Field, which is up north of Manila, and then over to Cabanatuan 1, which is across the valley. And I was there until 44. I went. They got on a detail to go to Japan. I got on a ship, and luckily we got through. Most of us had a bad trip, but it wasn't real bad physically. Just food and everything else is bad. And I worked in the coal mines in Japan and northern Kyushu, and was repatriated back to the States by air and arrived back in Oakland in September the 23rd. And I did my medical trip out here at Camp Pendleton at Santa Margarita Naval Hospital. And from there, I went to duty, and I retired with 25 years eventually from the Navy. And of the things that happened in that trip in the ship, we were loaded, and so many of us went into one hold. We couldn't stay there. They moved us to another hold, and there were about 750 men per hold in 2 holds, and that meant that you couldn't even all lay down at once without being on top of each other. So it was real crowded. Sanitary conditions were 0. And as a result, I got my second course of Emmetine eventually in the States. But I got amoebic dysentery again. So, and we arrived in Japan, and I assume that they didn't bother us much, but I think we smelled so bad when we got there that they wouldn't come close to us. And to board one of those ships, you, in the Japanese fashion, you go aboard, and what's on your body, your canteen and mess kit, you keep. but your hat, your shoes, and everything go down the hold, and all the baggage you might have, whatever it might be. And that left us with a march by a pile to get another bag, which in the Japanese Army, that'd be all the same thing. So they don't have to worry about it. But I didn't get mine; I got somebody else's, and that was it. So I think that that trip, although there were some reports that we heard later that there was some bad treatment on that ship by a few people, but not to most of us. They just let us suffer. We didn't have anybody die on the trip. We had one of our detail that went to the camp die of diphtheria. Or no, it wasn't diphtheria. It was lung disease after the war was ended. The poor guy left just that long. So that was about some of it. And if without going into any big details on the time we were in the Philippines, I can't describe it, but if those of you who haven't seen that movie about the relief of Cabanatuan, and I can't remember the name of it at the moment.
Great Raid.
Great Raid. That's we're seeing, and it's pretty authentic. It might be a little Hollywoodized for the flames and so forth about the fighting, but other than that, the story is pretty even. They filmed it in Australia and China, so the train isn't exactly right, but it's pretty close. Thank you.
All of my life I've been interested in zoology and in art. The two, one the science and the other as an artist. And I did that in high school. Everything I took and everything in college was always the two, zoo and also plant life and animal life and all that. I like that. So when I enlisted in the Army way back in 1941, I need those dates, thank you. I wanted to, when you enlist, you have a choice of where you can go. And at that time, my friends were being drafted, and I thought, well, I'll be drafted too. I'm very eligible. And so I thought, well, if I enlist, I wanted to get to the tropics because I've always been interested in plant life and animal life in the tropics. So I talked to the enlisted guy, and he said, I said, well, I want to go to the Palomar because I had heard they had an Army base there. And he said, well, we don't need anyone in Palomar, but we're taking people over in the Philippines. Well, I didn't know where the Philippines were, but he said, I said, oh, is it tropical? Oh, yes, it's tropical. So I said, okay, I'd like to go there. So the very next day after I was sworn in, I was taken by train up to San Francisco to Angel Island, and from there, after picking up endless cigarette butts and piecing up things that other people had dropped all over the base there on the island, I was shipped over to the Philippines. And it was a wonderful experience. I was in the medical corps, and they put me to work in the lab, and I didn't have any training at all. I didn't have any training as a medical man or as a lab guy or anything. I was just learning. They were so eager. I didn't know that at the time, but in retrospect, I can see how eager they were to get people over there. They knew something was coming up. So I did very well in the lab. I would learn a lot of stuff, and then Pearl Harbor came. So here we were sitting in the Philippines. The Fort McKinley was just in the suburbs of Manila, and we heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had happened, and we thought, oh my gosh, that's between us. That's between us and going home again. And the Japanese have attacked that. It was just incredible. We couldn't believe what was happening. That night, we were bombed by the Japanese. So the war was with us all at once, and I had no training in the military. I did barely learn how to salute. They taught me that very fast. And then the war was there. And the next day, our hospital, a small hospital, was flooded with people, with soldiers who had been injured in the bombing in Manila. So the whole thing was a whole new experience and overwhelming almost, but not completely. And I was learning very, very fast what to do and so on. And then before long, the Japanese were getting closer and closer to Manila, and we had to evacuate our hospital, and we were taken by bus to Bataan. And they had set up a field hospital there at Limay, Camp Limay, which is on the ocean or bay of Manila. And the war continued all around us. We saw planes strafing in our immediate area. Japanese planes were strafing and so on, and bombers would pass over. But they never bothered our hospital. We had big crosses on the top. Then from Camp Limay, we had to evacuate again. The Japanese were getting closer and closer again. We could hear them firing at night. And we went to the end of Bataan, the tip of Bataan, to Little Baguio. That was a field hospital there. And if we climbed up into a tree a few miles offshore, we could see the island of Corregidor. Well, so we couldn't go any further. This was it. And so we set up a field hospital there. It was bombed. This hospital was bombed by the Japanese. So we had people who were doubly wounded. They'd been wounded to be picked up from the front lines, and then they were wounded again by the shrapnel of the Japanese bombs. So they were in a terrible psychological shape and a terrible physical shape. A lot of our patients were killed, and so were some of the corpsmen. Well, the war continued, and eventually it caught up with us, and then Bataan fell. The Japanese overwhelmed the peninsula, and there's only one road on Bataan, and that's I guess they call it the Bataan Road. I never heard what anybody called it. But the Japanese tanks came down the road, and one of them came into our hospital grounds, and we were ordered to line up in front of them with our hands up in the air, hopefully a universal sign of surrender, and wait with our hands up in the air and facing the Japanese tanks that had machine guns mounted on top. So what was going to happen? We had no idea if we'd be mowed down or what was going to happen. In a little while, we were told to put our arms down and relax and go about our normal duties. The Japanese posted sentries around our hospital grounds to protect us from bands of Japanese who might come in and start to shoot us all up or whatever. They were protecting us. So we stayed there until the fall of Corregidor, which happened a month after the fall of Bataan. And then we stayed there a little while longer, and we took, they began to evacuate our hospital. The Japanese wanted the hospital off of Bataan. So, and during this time, unbeknownst to us, the Japanese the death march was forming and happening. It didn't have a name then, and we had no idea what was happening. That all the soldiers who were active, or any soldier at all, anyone in uniform was ordered off of Bataan, and they all had to take the single road off the Bataan Road, and it turned into a nightmare. We didn't know about it. We had our regular half rations of food, and later we were to meet the men who had been on the death march and hear their terrible stories and all. But a month or so after the fall of Corregidor, then the Japanese took the whole hospital in trucks to Bilibid in Manila. And there, including our patients, they took the corpsmen, the doctors, everyone. And there they separated us from our patients. I never knew what became of them. And the rest of us spent the rest of our time, the following 3 years, in Japanese prison camps. So from Manila, we went by boxcar to Cabanatuan. They took us there in boxers. At Cabanatuan, there's Cabanatuan 1 and Cabanatuan 2. Cabanatuan 1 was where we were taken. Cabanatuan 3 was the other one. And Cabanatuan 3 was where the prisoners of war from Corregidor were kept. Now, they were in good physical shape because they hadn't been starving on half rations and all of that. They had plenty of food on Corregidor. And they were relatively in good physical shape because they had caves that they could go into when the bombing was occurring and so on. So, but the condition at Cabanatuan were terrible. About 40 Americans were dying a day from dysentery and wounds, and the lack of sanitation, a lack of water, and they were weak to start with when they got there. And then and the food was very, very little. So I thought, well, myself and some other friends thought, well, we'll try to escape. And so there were 3 or 4 of us, and we were going to plan to go under the barbed wire fences, by the sentries, and go out into the cane fields that surrounded the camp. Well, before we could do that, the Japanese put all of the prisoners in what they call a blood group. If one of that group escaped, they would shoot the others. Well, and you never knew who was in your group. It would just happen. So we thought, well, we can't escape now. We can't do that. Put those other guys in danger for a foolhardy thing that we were planning. So then I decided I got to get to a smaller group. And my philosophy was, well, if there's a smaller group, there'd be more food around. And that's all I cared about then, because we were rapidly starving. So they were assembling a group of guys to go down somewhere and work, a work detail. And they needed some medical corpsmen and a couple of doctors. So I volunteered to go on that group. And that group ended up down at Puerto Princesa on the island of Palomar. And they were building an airstrip there. So and all the corpsmen were required to do was to wander around the airstrip, and if anyone got sick or got hurt or something, we could take them out and have them sit down, and then they would be taken back to our base camp to rest or be treated more or less. So it was an easy job, and the food was much better there, much, much better. The Japanese even issued us cigarettes, and that was our money in prison camp, was cigarettes. And so you could trade cigarettes for food if you wanted, or whatever. So then I began to think about escaping again, but I was too weak to escape. But the food I felt better and had more strength, and finally I practiced running around our barracks down at Puerto Princesa, and I could run again. So I thought, well, now I can consider being serious about escaping, because at least I had if you're going to escape, you should be able to run. That was my basic thought. So I talked with a number of guys at first, and I said, you know, we don't know what they're going to do. They have no record of who we are. As far as we knew, we weren't registered with the Red Cross. We had no idea if we even existed. So the Japanese, they were free to do with us, and they had never signed the Geneva Convention. So they felt no compulsion to treat us well or do anything. So I began to talk in these terms around to some of the fellow prisoners in prison camp in the evening when we weren't out in the field, of course. And but it became known, and one of the doctors, Dr. Hickman, stopped me in the barracks and said, "You know, I understand you're planning to escape." And I hadn't talked to him at all. So I was concerned that it had become common gossip in camp and that they might put me in prison because I was a menace to their status quo and so on. So I stopped talking to people at large. And then but I ended up with about 4 guys, and including myself. We were going to escape. So we were waiting for a rainy night when the guard took shelter in the showers that we had to pass. And then at the night finally came, the other 2 guys backed out, and then Hanson and myself were still going to go. So we went down, and sure enough, the guard had taken shelter in a kind of a rainy night, and we crossed over a couple of barbed wire fences out into the Bay of Manila, where the water was very shallow. Our barracks were on the bay, not on Manila, but on a bay at Puerto Princesa. So, and we were actually in the Sula Sea, if you had ever heard of that. Well, I hadn't. Anyway, we were walking in the waters of the Sula Sea. So we walked as far as we could and felt we were pretty much away from the camp, and then we had to cut inland because the water was getting impractical to be walking in. And then we thought, well, we'll rest the rest of the night here. It was getting light anyway, so then travel the next night. So we were sitting in a mangrove swamp, and we thought that would be a safe place. But then shortly after a while, we heard doors close, and we knew it was probably guards were searching for us. And then before very long, we were discovered by the Japanese Kempis, which are the Japanese military police. They took us prisoners, beat us up on the spot, and wanted to know where the other 2 prisoners were. Well, apparently, unknown to us, the other guys who were going to escape had escaped after all, and probably when they found that we had gone. So then that's what they wanted to know, and they took us back to the little village at Puerto Princesa where our barracks were, to the Kempis. We never were with the POWs in general again. And they questioned us for weeks and weeks, beating us up and interrogating us and wanting to know who else we were going to escape with, and they wanted names and so on. I quickly discovered that if I were talking to them, I wasn't being beat up, and we had to go through an interpreter. So with that thought in mind, I began to say, well, you know, all prisoners think of escaping. Once you're in prison, you think of escaping, and you all talk with each other. So for me to single out a single individual, that doesn't make sense. They all would like to escape, and they all talked about it. Well, he didn't think that was very funny. So he grabbed me by the collar of my kind of a shirt-like thing I was wearing and threw me over his shoulder, or tried to throw me over his shoulder because I was bigger than he was. And but finally, with a little leap from me, he threw me over his shoulder, and I fell on the concrete floor. And so he saved face, I saved face by letting him do it. And it was a crucial moment because then another guard who was with in this room with him, he came forward with a sword and aimed it at my groin while I was lying there on the floor. And I thought, this is, so what are they going to do? There was a very tense 4 or 5 seconds or so, and then he stopped. He didn't go on with his thrust. So then the interrogation continued. My friend Hansen was kept separate. We were both in separate cells. So we couldn't exchange a story to keep it straight. Anyway, we ended up, they didn't kill us. Each day they threatened us with beheading, and we had no reason not to believe them because that's what they did. And it was a constant threat that hung over us, with the threat of being beheaded. So one gave that a lot of thought of what it might feel like. Was it painful, or how would that feel? So probably one imagines more things than actually happen. So then we were taken, after a number of months, in the special prison under the Kempis, they took us back to Manila. And there we were turned over to the military police. And there we, then we had a trial, a court-martial by the Japanese Army. A lot of, there was a courtroom in Manila. We were taken there, and we walked into a room, Hanson and I, okay, thank you. Hanson and I had our court-martial, and then I'll continue later.